kind of wander through the rest of the province. They're still ongoing, I understand. Anyway, I was declined. They didn't have enough space on the agenda for the amount of applicants, so I decided to submit a written, which I did on Friday. And I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, because when I first wrote it, I was extremely angry. As I was typing, I could just feel the flush of the blood pressure going up, because it is going to impact my business in so many ways. It's not, well, it is calculable, because I did the math, and that was part of my written submission, was here's on my payroll of my one company alone. So I have a janitorial building services company, janitorial. Fully 85% of my costs are wages. Very, very little spent in the way of chemicals or equipment or supplies by comparison to the labor costs. It's virtually all labor. So I took my payroll for that one company, and I crunched the numbers. I broke it down to the number of annual hours paid to janitorial. I took the staff out, I took owner salaries out, and I just came up with the production hours. Bottom line, after I add in the new minimum wage, the 6% vacation after 5 years, because I do have a number of employees that have that, and the 2 paid sick days for 100 employees, my payroll costs alone will go up 39%. That's including labor burden, EI, CPP, all of EHT, WSIB. It's all based on payroll dollars. So it compounds. It's not enough to say that we're going to increase minimum wage. We're increasing EI and CPP, health tax, WSIB, benefits if there's any of that in there. That'll also increase what we pay out on for statutory holidays, because of course that's based on averaging of hours as well. So it's a huge increase to my operating costs, and a huge chunk off of the bottom line. To be exact, it exceeds what we will see as an increase in 2018 if these changes do go through. It exceeds my net profit of last year considerably.
I think that's probably one of the reasons that I don't think that a lot of people, maybe the people who are making minimum wage currently, do you think that a lot of them maybe don't have the exact numbers, or their managers or supervisors or business owners are telling them that, there's much more to the cost of labor besides that, but maybe they don't see the numbers?
I'm quite sure employees don't know what the burden costs are. I really don't. I think some of them probably don't even realize that for every dollar of CPP they have deducted, we submit the same amount on their behalf, or EI, we submit 1.4% of what's deducted off their check. I think most employees don't know that there's a contribution that goes towards them from the employer as well.
Well, I think that even though they get the pay stubs, they may not be noticing it. Because a lot of times it's broken down right on there, what all the deductions were, what extra was paid on their behalf.
They don't see. They don't see what's submitted on their behalf. They only see what's deducted from their own paycheck. It would be nice if there was a payroll software that showed, this is how much we deducted and this is how much the company submitted as well as on your behalf. But to my knowledge, there isn't a payroll company that
No, and
that
I'm wondering
that.
if there's any kind of online calculators so that even somebody who's trying to calculate what their paycheck is going to be, as opposed to just showing them what the actual net amount is, actually shows them the entire breakdown. There's always these online calculators. Maybe there's something like that out. I can do some research. Be the nerd that I am, I'll go and look it up.
Yeah, I don't know if there is or not. It would be interesting to know if any of the employees really cared.
Yeah, and then that's one of the reasons that I want to do this, is that because there is such a large chunk of the population that's going to be affected by this, not just business owners, even people who aren't currently making minimum wage, they're going to still be affected by price increases, right? And it may or may not even affect their own current wages. We don't know, depending on what their industry they're in or how they're being paid. So it's going to be an interesting thing, but I guess we're at a point now that it's basically going to be mandated. The changes are coming, right?
Something's coming.
Something
Absolutely.
is coming. Okay, so if you can't stop the train, what do you think the next step is for a business owner? Like, is it going to be basically reevaluating the entire employee section of things? It is an automatic price increase. Like, what is your priority of how you can sort of maybe get through the first 6 months of it without creating a huge upheaval on this end?
Well, I own a franchise, and so when the announcement came down from the Ministry of Labor about the proposed changes, we had an emergency conference call. And a number of the suggestions that were made, well, there were a number of suggestions made. Some of them were, we can just, send to all of our clients a letter across the board, 25% increase or 29% or whatever we felt was going to cover off on the increase. Excuse me, the increases that we were going to be having to absorb. Others came up with suggestions that if our clients simply can't bear a 25% increase in their services, will some of them let us go and do it in-house, or will they reduce the number of service days, or will they reduce the scope of work? If there's a reduction in service days or scope of work, there's a reduction in hours. So
it all filters down eventually.
It filters down one way, or it's either going to filter up to higher rates in the service industry, or it's going to filter down to reduction in hours. So at the end of the day, yes, the employee will be making a higher rate of pay. However, if they're working less hours, it's one of those one step forward, 1.5 or 2 steps back. We have to be able to retain our customer base, or we have, what's the purpose in being in business, and what's the purpose in having employees? So we've got to figure out where that sweet spot is between increasing our rates and reducing the service. And I think there'll be a bit of both, depending on the client. Also, in our industry, we may be, by some clients, even deemed as unnecessary. Look, we'll figure out a way to clean our own toilets or vacuum our own rugs.
I was going to say good luck to you. I guess it's one of those. It's one of those services that sometimes gets overlooked, but is usually a necessity, right?
Well, and in my written submission, I suggested that if at some point maybe you arrive to work and find that your garbage hasn't been cleaned, or there's no toilet paper in the dispenser in the bathroom, you'll know why.
It's the little things, right?
It's the little things. Another huge factor for me is the personal emergency leave days. Never mind that I'm paying 2 days of sick time. I understand that, and I can accept that. But the other 8 days where an employee can just simply choose not to come to work, if they're on a schedule already, you're scrambling in the morning to find somebody to cover that shift. The burden is going to be borne by their co-workers if they work in a team environment. Everybody will be doing, 5 people will be doing the work of 6, or 3 people will be doing the work of 4. It's going to be a nightmare, certainly in my industry, to be able to cover off, and in my case, 1,000 days a year. I have to be prepared to fill 1,000 shifts, potentially,
yes,
for 100 employees, 10 days off in an entire year. And sure, there'll be people that won't take any of those days, because 8 of the 10 are not paid, but there will be employees that take all of them. So I have to prepare for that.
So is there, because as much as I've read about the new changes that are coming through, we talk about the personal emergency days. Is there an exact definition of what qualifies as an emergency? Is that part of the problem? Is that if somebody just claims that this is a personal emergency for me, they have the right to take that time off?
That's my understanding. Now, I don't know whether there's going to be rules surrounding notice time to the employer. I know that you can't ask for an explanation. Suffice it to say the employee is taking a day off. I don't know whether there will be rules around whether they can take the Monday after, or the Tuesday after a long weekend, or the Friday before a long weekend.
I've also seen evidence of that occasionally in my previous businesses. But yes, they seem to, seems to be like the after-hour shifts or the longer shifts are the first ones that they don't want on weekends. But it also depends on the worker, and I think that's basically going to hopefully kind of draw a line in the sand of which workers are going to step up to the plate and which ones are going to kind of look at every kind of loophole. I mean, they're already there, I'm sure, but I guess I'm kind of nervous about how that's going to affect, because I know that there's that 48-hour window now that's coming into effect where if you need to change a shift or cancel it, so the employer now has to give 48 hours
Yeah.
notice, but the employee themselves can call in that morning and say, I'm not coming in.
Or not call in at all.
They don't have to call in. There's no notice required. We know there's no statements on it yet.
Well, there's no statements on it yet, but I mean that's the what we call it, no call, no show. It happens. It happens certainly in my industry, and eventually you get a hold of the employee, and oh yeah, whatever the excuse might be. But the dilemma here in Sudbury is, and all of northeastern Ontario, I believe, we all have the same problem. There's a chronic shortage of workers, and it's a tough industry to staff, and so you tend to have to kind of look the other way often when that occurs. Okay, well, I'd like you to understand the importance of notifying us so that we can cover that shift. But you're right. So speaking about the shift change notification. How do you marry those two new changes to legislation? Everybody's entitled to 10 days off, and yet everybody's entitled to 48 hours notice to change their shift. I have to tell you, Stephanie, pretty much every day of the year around here, my schedule, and we have we call them rolling schedules, so they're 2 weeks at a time. Every Monday, this week drops off and another week is added on, and we just keep rolling ahead.
So everyone knows their schedule well in advance.
Everyone knows their schedule well in advance, 2 weeks.
That's beyond that 48 hours minimum.
Yes. However, today, for instance, people called in sick. So right out of the gate, I've got shifts to fill, and I can't give anybody 48 hours notice.
Yeah, so when you think about that, so how is that going to fill? So if someone does call in sick, the employee can take the shift because you have to give 48 hours notice.
They can take it.
They can still take it,
yes.
But they have every right to refuse it, and you can't penalize them for it. That's the issue.
Absolutely, yeah. So, you start the call around, and hopefully somebody will grab, but they don't have to. And you know what, as it turns out right now, they often decline on short notice because they've made plans. It's their scheduled day off and they've made plans. So I don't think that we're going to have any more or any less trouble filling the shifts. I think we're just going to have more of them to fill, because it's going to be that easy to
do. You have any casual employees basically on the payroll right now where they're sort of temporary workers that you bring in, or are you finding you're going to maybe have to hire more of those, or keep them sort of not on call necessarily, but just on a casual basis here and there for seasonal?
We do certainly have, we don't have anything seasonal.
Okay.
Other than in the winter, it typically takes longer to clean a location simply because of what we deal with up here, salt and sand
Sludge.
and muck and sludge. Yeah. So we don't really have seasonal work. However, it's difficult to have on-call staff that know all of your locations. And the thing is, you don't know what location you're going to have to backfill a shift on. If I've got people that are calling in at valet, for instance, I can't send just anybody. They have to have had an entire set of specific training, safety training modules done, and then they have to have been site-specifically trained. So I may have people that are cleaning and valet at this location, but if somebody calls in sick at this location, if they haven't got the site-specific training, I can't even send them. So oftentimes we can't backfill particular shifts because of the locations. So the thought process of having somebody kind of ready to go, it's just too onerous. They'd have to be trained on literally every building that I clean, and it's just not conceivable.
I think that training and that for having enough skilled labor with the proper training is going to be not a requirement, but it's going to become up more of a conversation, I think, for those kind of situations in almost every industry.
Yeah.
I even know in the restaurant and food industry, it's the same idea. As much as I can have, a long list of high school students that are willing to work because they're eager and they want extra cash, I still have to train them.
Yeah.
A lot of them maybe have never worked in the restaurant industry, or they've never served food before. They may not have their smart serve to serve alcohol. Like there's all these different things, costs and time that's involved.
Exactly.
So filling in is not always as easy, and I think that's going to be because we're kind of leaning towards we are this service-driven economy, that the services are kind of what matter, sort of making our lives a little bit better. So I guess what we're trying to figure out now is that if this new, because it's coming up soon, and there's still so many questions out there, if there's going to be one particular issue of those list of changes that are coming between January that you can see that, okay, well, if they just maybe cut back or change this one thing, it might make it a little more tolerable as a business owner starting in January 2018. Is there one thing that you can think of, well, if they just kind of eased off on this specifically, I think it'll make a big difference?
Well, I was listening to some of the presentations at the North Bay committee meeting, and one of the I think corporate managers for the Applebee group of restaurants presented, and his request was too much too soon or too much too quickly. His recommendation was at the end of his presentation, could we not stretch this out over 3 or 4 or 5 years? You know, you went years without having any marked increase in minimum wage, 2 or 3% over 2 or 3 years, and then a couple of quick ones over the last 2016, 2017. But one of the things that, and I'm heavily involved at our local Chamber of Commerce, and one of the things that we've been advocating for, because it always comes up as a topic of conversation, is let's have an annual increase to the minimum wage that is kind of attached to or in recognition of the CPI. And that way everybody gets a similar increase, whether it's somebody making $30 an hour who has an annual increase based on consumer price index or cost of living increase. Why not the people that are at the lower wage scale as well? And nobody ever really discussed it or could come up with a reason why. So it basically was the decision to increase or not increase was left with the government, the provincial government of the day. So here we are now, fast forward or catch up, I guess. We're looking at I think it's 22.5% between minimum wage now and Jan 1's proposal of $14 an hour, and another 7% 12 months hence.
And with all of those other changes, with the amount of notice, everything else, all of that's coming into effect right away as well, right? It is.
And 175 new Ministry of Labour inspectors. My fear is that they'll just be knocking on doors and handing out punitive action. Here's a fine, you're not in compliance. One of the requests or questions I asked in my submission was, what are you going to do to educate us all? What are you going to do to educate the existing MOL officers when you call and have a question? Are they going to have the answers? And everything, or not everything, but certainly a lot of the changes are very ambiguous. For instance, card-based certification for building services, which my company falls under. The change that they're recommending is if a particular union can come up with 20% about 20% of your staff that are interested in joining the union or creating a union within your workplace, you will be requested to hand over your employee information list, names and telephone numbers. So my question was, well, is it about 20%, or does that mean 18% will do the trick, or maybe 12%, and how is it that, under the freedom of information, and I can't ask who those individuals are to see that they do in fact have 20% of my workforce, yet freedom of information doesn't apply when I'm requested or demanded to hand over my employees' information. Maybe they don't want it handed over.
Well, it's like, as an employee, if I had no interest in joining a union, I've never expressed an interest, to be told by my employer that, oh, by the way, I'm giving all of your personal information to this particular union.
Yeah.
And they may not understand that, well, it's mandated by law.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So my suggestion was possibly if we get to that point where a particular union has what they consider to be an adequate number of my employees that are interested in joining a union or starting a union in the workplace, that maybe that list needs to be confirmed or legitimized by one of the bargaining groups.
That would make sense, just to make it fair on one end, because there's an evidence has to be an evidence-based argument, right? They need
Yeah.
to provide proof of some sort, as opposed to that they're actually current employees, as opposed to past employees.
Yes, so I'd like clarification on that. I think that absolutely needs to happen. So those are the four biggies that are going to have a huge impact on my business: card-based certification, minimum wage, personal emergency leave days, and paying the 2 sick days and paying vacation after 5 years. I'd also like to state that I don't pay minimum wage. I never have.
No.
I always felt that you got a minimum effort for minimum wage.
Absolutely.
However, in my industry, there's not a lot of wiggle room if I want to be competitive and actually be successful in the bidding process. So we're not a huge percentage above minimum wage, but we are. However, having said that, there's still an expectation that they be earning above minimum wage. So I'm still looking at 22% and then another 7% to bring up the individuals so that they aren't working at minimum wage. Right now they aren't, but
some
they
of them
will
may
be.
be.
At
Exactly
$14 an hour, they will be considered to be minimum wage. So.
And I'm sure that there's always going to be employees in all sectors that are going to be, once the announcement was made, they're already sitting at home with their calculator saying, well, I already made this, I'm already making this, so I'm automatically going to be making this.
And not just minimum wage. In our construction business, we have laborers that are looking at probably expecting about $2 an hour increase in their hourly rate as well. And they've been very vocal about it. They've immediately approached HR and said, what about us? And the thing that they need to realize is that some jobs are not minimum wage jobs, whether it's because they have a particular skill set that they've been trained for, or they have tenure within the company, or they've got an education that maybe the others don't. And in my submission, I used, you've got a PSW, and you've got an RPN, and you've got an RN, and you've got a nurse practitioner, and you've got a physician. If the PSW is bumped up now to what the RPN is making, the RPN is not going to be satisfied. She's got a different skill set, different responsibilities on the job, gone to school longer. Her expectation that she's going to go up. Well, that closes the gap then between she and the RN. And the RN, you can bet your boots, their bargaining unit is going to say, okay, so, we need to widen that gap again because again, we have higher education, higher responsibilities, all the rest. So where does it end? It doesn't. It doesn't end till you get to the top.
And even when it gets to the top, it is still going to be always a negotiation. And then when those costs go up, it's going to spiral back down to the bottom again.
The end user, absolutely. And we're all end users, including the staff. They buy groceries, they buy gas, they buy clothing. So it's not going to close any wage gap. It's just going to increase right from the
prices,
bottom to the top.
So their disposable income, as much as they, I think that's one of the, I want to say the big flag that they're raising, saying it's going to increase their disposable income for the people who are making minimum wage now. But if their actual costs of living end up going up, right? Their costs of regular services, their costs of, not just like going to doctors or clinics, but their cost of everyday living, their restaurant prices, if everything's going to go up, their disposable income is probably not going to change all that much.
No, there might be kind of a sweet spot of 6 or 12 months where they, before the rest of the economy reacts to the new increases. But I know I can't wait that long. Again, 85% of my cost of doing business is labor. I will have my decision on how I'm going to approach my clients, whether it's an increase of 25% to their billing, or a reduction in service vis-a-vis a reduction in staffing hours, or a combination thereof. I'm muddling and working through that now. But the reality is, I only have so much money to spend on payroll, and my clients only have so much money to spend on janitorial service. So something's got to give.
Exactly. So there's going to have to be that line in the sand, and it'll be interesting to see how things go forward. I'm hoping that your decisions aren't going to have to be too detrimental to not just the business, but your employees and your clients. It's going to be a big change for everyone. I mean, I travel the world and I see how there's levels of price increases and what people are getting paid, and I talk to a lot of people when I'm traveling, and I think that it's always that time of change that really tends to kind of fluctuate and really kind of skews things.
It's scary.
It's going to, I mean, so you can't call it a honeymoon period because I don't think it's going to be pleasant on all parts.
No.
So it is going to be a huge change. And especially when things come into effect in, of all times, January, where people already have less time, less hours, less money as it is after the holidays. So it's just coming in probably at a bad time.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that the election coming up soon is probably going to make a big change in that. So we're probably going to hear more about it, I'm guessing.
Well, I don't know that the election is going to have any effect on these changes, other than if the second and third reading is delayed in the House, then it may go back to square one. But I don't think that will be the case. I think there's enough time between now and, 16 months from now?
Yep.
So I think that we're going to see the changes are pushed through. I do think that the only concession that we may see is the introduction of that vast increase, possibly stretched out over 2 or 3. Yeah, given a little bit longer time to adapt to it. But I think the rest of the changes are a foregone conclusion.
I guess as a business owner, you're going to have to plan for the worst.
Yeah, hope for the best and plan for the worst.
Yep.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
is not any way to start, to work on a business, let alone try to start a business right now too. So
yeah.
I said I'm stepping away from that business owner side to that extent anymore. So I do not envy you and the decisions you have to make.
With the launch of your new business, you will not have any employees.
No, they're going to be. I mean, I already have a part-time person, and I already pay her more than minimum wage. But she's also sort of self-employed on her own, so I'm more contracting out.
Okay.
But I do realize that there's a lot of their own expenses are going to increase as well.
And changes to how employees are identified as either contractors or employees is going to change as well. I did not spend a lot of time reading those proposed changes because it doesn't affect us. Everybody that works for me is an employee and on payroll as such. So I kind of dug into the things that were going to affect my service industry, and to some degree our construction company as well, but to a lesser degree that company. But again, just by virtue of how much of my operating costs are labor and burden related, huge impact.
Yeah, it's kind of scary to see. I mean, I did some research and did some notes this morning, but it'll be interesting to talk to, or maybe I'll do some number crunching at some point. But I'm talking to a restaurant owner because the servers, as much as it's going up to 14 or 15, anyone who serves alcohol, they're actually not getting the same increase as everyone else is because they rely on the tips.
Okay.
So it actually worked out to, I think they're going up to 13 or something by 2019. So they're only at 9. They're just going up to 10 as of this October. And then by January, they're getting a smaller increase. But it's a little bit less than, because they supposedly make a lot more tips when they're anything having to do with serving alcohol. But as a person who goes to a restaurant, there's many restaurants who have a liquor license. So the staff are qualified and able to serve alcohol. Yeah. But it's not a place where there's a lot of drinking involved. So they don't necessarily make that extra amount of tips, right? So it'll be interesting to see, because when I have talked to some managers, restaurant owners, in their minds that their servers are making $30 to $40 an hour with their tips. And that's, wow. So I would be interested to see, is that $30 to $40 an hour on average over a standard week? Or is it $30 to $40 an hour average over the 4-hour shift? Yeah. Because usually, unless you're lucky enough to find a daytime 40-hour a week restaurant job, which is very hard to find, it's not the same. Most of the staff that I know, even the ones that worked for me part-time, even the ones who said they worked full-time, their idea of full-time is 30 to 35 hours a week. And a lot of them have their shifts canceled, or they're sent home if it's not busy. Or they don't have the schedule till split shifts, exactly. Or they're being sent to a different section if there's no one coming in that section. So there's a lot of gray area. So, but I know that as long as the business owners and the managers expect or have that filter on that, oh my goodness, my servers already make too much money, the first thing that they're going to do is raise their prices immediately. And I don't think that's always a bad idea. Because there are some restaurants that are basically just they're so scared to raise their prices because of how customers react. And here in Sudbury, I know compared to other cities, we've been very lucky so far on our restaurant prices. Yes.
Okay.
And it's just because based on what the market will bear, right? So yes, change is going to happen, but around the holidays and stuff, people tend to spend a little bit more money on eating out, but it'll be interesting to see how this Christmas or this holiday season compares to previous ones, because the first set of changes are coming through with the small change in the minimum wage increase, and then starting in January they get the big one with all the other changes that are coming. So it'll be interesting to see the reaction or how things change in the restaurant between now and then.
Yeah. I'm not surprised to hear that there's the difference between the minimum wage for a server and the tip. We all know. We all eat in restaurants, and we all know that if you've got a really, really together, bang-on server, you tend to be more relaxed at the table. If you have time, you tend to have that second glass of wine, and you tend to tip accordingly.
Yes.
From the perspective of the employer, I would think that the higher the tips, I mean,
it's a win-win.
It's a win-win, absolutely.
It is,
absolutely.
but the interesting thing is that it has to do with whether the tips are, because I think there's that automatic assumption, even again by the business owner, that they're always making that level, that 15 to 20% on every single order, and they're not. And I just know that from experience myself. So when I'm traveling, I just came back from Australia and New Zealand. The interesting thing is, tipping is not mandatory. It's actually almost unheard of, unless you're in a very high-end restaurant where if you wanted to give 10%, right? But their minimum wage right now is at $17 an hour, and that's for restaurant workers.
Wow.
And they have what they call a casual overage, or there's some kind of a special funding on top of that for casual workers. So if you hire somebody on a casual basis, you need to pay them, I think it's almost 25% per hour for the rate more than, because you're only keeping them for a certain period of time.
Wow.
So, but it works out, so the actual restaurant prices were more expensive. But as you sit down and if you overlook that and think, okay, well, I'm not also adding a 20% tip at the end, it does kind of balance it out. So it'll be interesting to see. I know that there's some restaurants I know down in Southern Ontario that are already starting that, where they're going to require no tipping. Say we pay everybody a fairly good wage here in this particular restaurant, so there's no tipping required. And does it basically equal into better sales? Or is that going to hinder, or there's going to be more people working there?
Or less.
Or
You
less.
have to wonder if service would just not be interested.
Yeah, so there's some experimenting that's happening. I've heard about it a little bit down in the States, a little bit down in Toronto. So I'm actually hoping that maybe end of the summer, I actually want to go into one of those restaurants and sort of talk to them and see if that change is happening. Because the restaurants that I went to where there was no tipping in Australia, service was top notch. They're happier. There's no stress about, okay, if they're always suspicious sometimes, unfortunately, servers, depending on how you behave with them and how you're ordering. But I've never had bad service when I was there. Everybody was in a great mood. There was no looking at the clock constantly because they have to leave.
Right.
Right? It was a different experience.
Or get you moved out to get the next tipping client in.
Yeah, exactly.
Which you sometimes suffer with in the restaurants when they're busy here.
Yeah.
You kind of get that, feeling like you're being rushed because you're not going to spend any more. If you're spending an hour over a cup of coffee at the end of your meal, the bill's tallied, you're done, and yet they're not producing any revenue by you sitting there. So that would definitely take that element of service.
But if the tipping part of it, that's what I'm saying, like, and maybe in the restaurant industry there is that flexibility with how the legislation or how the payments can change to create something that's a bit of more of a win-win. But how can we do that with all the industries across the board? Right?
And that's just it. I mean, there's so many moving parts to this change in legislation. How it will affect the cost of goods, how it will affect healthcare. If the minimum wage is going up, PSWs going up, it's hard to staff now. There's a chronic shortage of PSWs. What's that going to do to the cost of healthcare? I mean, there are healthcare territories, Sudbury being, Lynn, northeastern Ontario, I think, that are struggling every day to, rob from one budget to throw money into another budget. I mean, it's so chronically poor, our healthcare system as it is. That's just going to take a huge bite out of yet again money that isn't there to spend in the first place. Just all of every industry, retail. Will we be able to afford products that are made in North America, or will there be even more outsourcing offshore? I see a lot of split shifts in food service, retail, my industry maybe.
That's right.
Because I do have some daytime contracts, I can see having people come in and clean for 2 or 3 or 4 hours on a schedule in the morning and then go home and back out in the evening. Lots of moving parts. I had lunch at a business function with an individual, and he has he's in mining, what do you call it? Innovation, mining, remote access mining.
Okay.
And so very high tech electronic stuff that they're developing. And he said, I've got an office in Central America somewhere, Brazil or Argentina or I forget where. He said, I'll just move the jobs there. Everything's done online anyway. So there's another solution.
Exactly, but it doesn't solve the problem of the
that the Premier is trying to solve.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a short-term solution for a long-term problem.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that's being felt. It's not even just in Ontario or in Canada. It's basically everywhere. There seems to be this crunch where you're trying to either fill jobs and pay a decent wage and have decent living. There's a larger problem, I think, overall. And I'm concerned just personally, as much as that, yes, I'd love to see people get paid more.
I'd love to pay everybody $50,000
absolutely, but
a
I
year.
think it's so quick, and it's just a quick solution that may only take effect or make something better for a very short period of time, and then it's not going to solve itself.
No, we're back in the same cycle again of there's always going to be wage gaps because not every job has the same value to society, and not everybody brings the same skill set to their job. That's not to suggest that food service or janitorial service or nighttime security or any of the industries that tend to pay in the lower wage category are not valued services.
No.
Society has set the rate.
That's exactly it. They've sort of said it that way, but then when they go home, when they're in their own homes with their own families, they have a different attitude. So it's, I don't know what the solution is either, but it's going to be an interesting year going ahead. And as I'm traveling, one of my goals actually is that, so as much as I'm gathering servers here to have conversations, I'm heading to Calgary in September. I'm going to be in Nashville later this fall. I'm thinking of possibly Cuba at the end of the year. I'm in Halifax at the beginning of August. So I'm hoping that as I'm traveling and I'm talking to different people, that as I'm gathering ideas or having conversations, at least if people have more information, at least if business owners get a chance to state their case or how things are changing for them, and then same thing on the workers' side of things, and then I talk to consumers on the other side about how they're feeling about certain price increases. Maybe that there's different suggestions, or there's a lot of misinformation out there that people are not understanding.
I think we're going to see an immediate increase in the price of gas.
Yeah.
Because
that's the first one. So that's the first one that always jumps, right?
Food is going to take a huge spike, I think. Consumer goods, I think there'll be a bit of a delay. Retail, consumer type things. Certainly anything service related is going to. A report that I read having to do with the change or massive increase in minimum wage, and I think it was Seattle. Restaurants, fast food restaurants immediately went to self-serve kiosks.
Yes.
And apparently there's one at the McDonald's down the street here. You order up your burger, you choose your pickles and your onions, and
do it yourself.
You don't want ketchup, and do it yourself. And the order goes to the kitchen, and they prepare it and bring it out to you.
Yep. Technology came in and just replaced.
Yeah, and I believe you also pay at the kiosk as well. If I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
everything is all the same, and it's even down to smaller communities because I believe Sturgeon Falls,
Okay.
their McDonald's has the same thing, and we've traveled and we've seen it over the last year or so. But when I was overseas someplace, and it wasn't just McDonald's, but other ones were already implementing these new self-serve kiosks.
So that eliminates the frontline workers,
That's right.
and those are all students.
Yep.
And yes, they're minimum wage, but they're high school students or college students. They're, a good number of them are. Management tends to be older, more experienced individuals, but that frontline group, they need those jobs, and they're going to suffer because they no longer will be there. I'm seeing robotic vacuum cleaners in industrial applications. I mean,
Like
we've
a
all
Roomba,
seen
like
the
those little
Roomba.
Roombas?
Yeah, only on a bigger scale for bigger buildings, and they get turned on at 5:01 when the last person's out the door, and they run all night. So that's my world. That's where my world is
I
headed.
guess technology is always going to have a hand in anything.
There's certain things it'll never do. I don't think technology will ever clean a toilet properly.
No.
Technology probably couldn't ever make up a bed or scrub down a shower. But
And have a great chat with you when you're ordering a cup of coffee.
yes,
Right?
exactly.
The service side and the personal, I think the one-to-one thing is going to be a big difference. One of the things I'm going to, my other industry that I really want to check on is going to be the tourism industry. I mean, hotels are going to have a big hit as well, not just restaurants. And I think of people who are cleaning the rooms, the other staff, janitorial staff that are in hotels as well.
Yeah.
That's a big chunk of their price, and that's the first thing people complain about when they're traveling if things aren't up to par is those service things.
Absolutely.
So the tourism side of things, and when you think about like taxi drivers, bus drivers, there's so many parts to that tourism thing that I think it's going to affect, and that people may not travel as much, or their distance that they're traveling is not as much. Yeah. So I think you just made up my mind. I'm going to go and talk to the girls over at Sudbury Tourism and see if they're hearing anything on their end from the hospitality industry in a whole, if there's going to be any major changes, or how, as a city, I mean, we're already spending so much time and effort trying to promote the city as a tourist destination.
Yeah.
And then if the industries are getting hit with additional costs, or not wanting to start new businesses on their own, how do we still get people to drive up here to come here? Yeah, it's going to be fascinating.
You might reach out to one of the hotels to find out how it's going to affect their housekeeping department, because you're right, that's a huge component of whether an individual is happy with their stay in a hotel or not.
It's one of the first things, if you look on TripAdvisor, one of the first comments, or actually one of the little check boxes, even if you didn't want to leave comments, usually has to do with cleanliness.
Yeah, housekeeping, cleanliness, all of it.